Hi, my name's Leigh Halliday, and today we're going to be using data-driven styling to style a Google map in React. And what we're going to do is highlight each of the zip codes and style that zip code according to the USDA hardiness zone, or the growing zone, which will basically tell you how warm or cold that zip code is and therefore what plants you can grow there. But before we get to that functionality, we're going to start by just rendering out a bare bones map, and then we'll start layering on functionality to that map. So I have in Next.js a page or a component that's just rendering out a div that says the word map right now. So if I go over here to the browser, that's what I see. And I need to replace this with the Google Map provider. So we'll just delete this and we'll say Google Map provider. And it needs a couple things to work. The first thing it needs are some map options. So we'll say options is equal to map options. And that doesn't exist yet, so we're going to come up here and define it. Map options. And we need to give it two things. The first thing is the initial zoom level. If you don't provide that, it won't work. The next thing we need to do is tell it where to center the map when it originally loads. So we're going to say a latitude of 40 and a longitude of minus 88, which will be somewhere in the middle of the US. And that should be good for options. So now we can move back to the Google Map provider and pass the second thing it needs, which is the Google Maps API key. So Google Maps API key is going to be equal to an environment variable that I've loaded into the .env.local file, which gets picked up automatically in Next.js. So here we're going to be accessing the map API key. So we'll come back and we'll say process.env.map API key. And if we go and look at our browser, nothing's rendering yet. So we're not quite there. What we need to do is place a div in here. And we can do an early close div like that. And what this div needs to do is basically store a ref. So the ref, we're going to store a ref in state in this case so that we can pass this ref to the Google Map provider and it can sort of detect when it's changing. So for that, we'll set up some state here. And we'll say that the map container and set map container is the hook use state. And when we have that in place, if you pass a function to the ref prop, it basically detects that and it calls the function and it gives you the DOM node. So we can take that DOM node and then pass it to the set map container state function, and we can pass in the node here. And that will basically bring the ref to this div and put it into this map container state. So then what we can do is we can pass this state to the Google Map provider. So it wants the map container like that. Almost there. We're just missing one thing. So the last thing we're missing is basically this div is rendering out, but it's being rendered with 0 height. So that's why you can't see the map, because it's sort of squished to 0 pixels. So if we give it a style and we just say that the height is 100 VH, if all worked as planned, we now have a bare bones map rendering on the screen in React. So with this in place, we're basically now able to move on to the data-driven styling part of this demo. And for that, we need to make a few changes both to the options and to the Google Map provider. So what we need to do is we need to give it a map ID. So I also set this up in my environment variables. So we'll just copy this and we'll say process.env.that. But why don't I first show how do you set up a map ID correctly to work with data-driven styling. So we're going to go over to the web, to the Google Maps platform console. And the first thing we're going to do is set up a style. So I'll click Create Style. So here's where we can define what the map should look like. So you can choose if you want the dark style, or you can import your own JSON to have a lot of control over that. And we'll just click Save and we'll give it a name. So we'll just call this Demo. And once we save this, we need to set the feature layers. So feature layers are basically what level of data-driven styling do you want to apply to the map? Is it at the country level, or in our case, at the postal code level? So we'll click that and we'll save it. And the next thing you need is a map ID to apply this style to. So if you click over to Map Management, you can create a map. We'll give it the same name, so demo, and we want a JavaScript map. And you'll need to set this to vector for it to work correctly. So once you set up the map ID, you can apply the demo styling that we set up to this map ID. So you would save that, and then you would be able to use this map ID in your React app. So we've already done that, and we've set it up here for a different map ID that I've put into my .env.local. So why don't we go and try and use this map ID here? If I refresh, I think it should be working. Perfect. And you see the map styling that I applied to it. But there's one thing I need to do for data-driven styling to work. And depending when you're watching this video, this may not be necessary. But right now you need to update the version to beta because this is very new functionality that we're working with. So once we have this in place, we've got our map ID and we're now ready to apply data-driven styling to it. And what we need to do is basically detect when the map is loaded and ready to go. And then we can access a layer and start applying functionality to it. So what we're going to do is we're going to say onload. We'll call a function and we'll just call it the onload function that doesn't yet exist. So we'll create this and we'll say onload. And we're going to use another hook called useCallback. What this does is basically it sort of memoizes a function, or it makes sure every time it re-renders in React, it's using the original function, not sort of generating a new one every time. And that will help with performance. So when onload is called, it will give us a reference to the map, which we can then pass to a function that we'll create very shortly called addZoneLayer, and that will receive the map. So why don't I come down here and we'll create the addZoneLayer function. So function addZoneLayer, remember that it received the map. And in here, the first thing I want to do is just double check that this map actually supports data-driven styling. So we'll put this in a sort of an early return where we say if not. So if it doesn't support this functionality, we'll say map.getMapCapabilities. And then on that, we can say, is data-driven styling available? So if that is not true, just return, because there's not really much we can do past that point. If it's true, we can work on the rest where we actually go and we apply styling to each of the different zip codes in the US. And the way that that works is we first want to access the sort of layer that we went and just set up when we were creating our map ID, which is the postal code layer. So we'll say const feature layer is equal to map.getFeatureLayer. And which one do we want? We want postal code, which is the same thing as zip code, depending where you are in the world. And on this feature layer, there's a style property that we can assign a function to. So we'll say feature is what we want to access from this function when it's called. And what is this? Basically, every time the map is rendering a zip code, it's going to call this style function, and then we can control what styling to apply to that zip code area on the map. And if we just look at actually console.log, we'll access the feature.displayName. We can see what it's doing. So if I refresh, you're going to see a whole bunch of zip codes being rendered out in the console. So that's each of the zip codes in the map right now. It's calling the style function, and it's up to us basically how we want to style that. So the first thing we'll do is we'll just put the zip into a variable so it's easier to access. So feature.displayName. And then from the zip code, I need to determine the USDA growing zone. So up at the top of the file, you can see that I imported the zones from data zones. And if we click over here, this is basically a map or an object that maps the zip code to the USDA growing zone. So for 10,001, that is 7B growing zone. So what we can do there is basically do that lookup. So we'll say zone is zones of the zip. And that will give us the growing zone for that zip code. So let's just double check if there isn't a zone for that zip code. Maybe you're in a different country or we don't have it for whatever reason. Well, we can't style it if that's the case. But if it is there, what we can do is return some styles to apply to that zip code layer. So we're going to set two properties. We're going to set the fill color. And we need to figure out what color to apply to a zip code depending on the growing zone. And I have another file called colors that I've set up here. And this maps each growing zone to a different color so that we can have the map sort of show the different growing zones in different colors, where it goes from very cool all the way up to very hot. So what we'll do is we'll come down here and we'll say the colors at the zone is the fill color we want to apply. And because that can be really strong, we'll just update the opacity to be 0.5 so that it's not just this like very strong hard color. And then we'll refresh the map. And you can see that now each zip code has the color of the growing zone applied to it. So if I zoom out a little bit and I zoom up here, you can see as it starts to get colder, as we move closer to Canada, you get this lighter shade of pink. And if we go down here to Texas, you get like a stronger red. Or if we pop over to Miami and go to down here, it's like a very hot temperature, which means you get that higher growing zone. The next thing I want to do is basically enable the user to click into a zip code and pop up an info window that shows what zone that is, so you don't just have to guess based on the color. So what we're going to do outside of this style function, let's just set up an info window that we'll reuse every time you click. So info window is new google.maps.info window. And then we want to attach a click listener to the feature layer. So we'll say feature layer.add listener, which event, click, and what we'll receive is the event. And from this event, we need to basically get the first feature that was in that event. So we'll say feature is equal to event.features, the first one, 0. And we're just going to double check that this feature corresponds to a place ID, because if not, it's not really the type of feature we're working with right now. So if not feature.placeID, let's early return. And at this point on, we're basically using the same logic as above, where from the feature, we're getting the display name, which is actually the zip code. From the zip code, we're getting the growing zone. And if we don't have a growing zone for that zip code, let's just early return. If all of those things are true, meaning we can show the info window. But the first thing we need to do is basically decide where on the map do we show this info window. So we'll call set position, and we can use the event.latitude longitude. So basically wherever the user clicked as its position. And now we want to set the content of the info window. So we'll use a backtick string. And in here, we'll start by saying we want a div. I'm going to add a class to this div with some simple styling I set up over here in styles global. Basically just set the color of the text. So with that in place, what we can do is basically add some content. So we'll do an H2 that says zone, and we'll highlight the growing zone that it is, and we'll close our H2. And down in a paragraph, we'll say zip is USDA zone, and then we'll just repeat the zone here, and we'll close the P. And why don't we put a period too? Okay, not quite there yet. We now need to open the info window. We've set where it is, we've set its content, but now we need to open it on the map. So we'll say info window.open, and we'll pass in the map just like that. So if I come back and refresh, I should be able to click an area and it will pop up the info window saying, hey, this is zone B. The zip that it is USDA zone 5B. So if again, we go down to warmer areas, you zoom out a little bit, We'll go down into Florida. We click here, and this is now a 10A zone. And if you take that 10A zone and you go to a nursery or you're Googling around, you can basically find out, hey, what plants grow in 10A? So you can buy the appropriate plants that thrive in your area. The last thing we're going to do is we're going to use Google Places and Google Places Autocomplete to allow you to search for where you live so you can more easily click on your zip code and see what your growing zone is. So for that, we're going to come up and we're first going to make a tweak again to the Google Map provider where we need to add in an additional library to work with. So that would be an array. We're going to be loading the Places library because that's needed for the Google Places Autocomplete. Now, with that set up, we're going to create a component inside of the Google Map provider and we'll call it Autocomplete. And we will do a close here. And now we need to come down, and why don't we just do that right below? So we'll say function autocomplete like this. And what we're going to do is return an input. So we'll start off by saying input, return, and we need to keep track of its value and when that value changes in state. So we'll come up here and we will say const value and set value is equal to use state, and we'll start it with an empty string. And now we can say the value is value. And maybe even to be clearer, why don't we call this the input value, because value is a pretty generic name. So now we can say input value. And on change, we're going to receive the event. And we can take the event and call set input value. And what we can do then is access the event.target, which would be the input itself and the value. So let's save that, come back here, and it's not showing up anywhere yet. It's actually being rendered either below or behind the map. But once we attach autocomplete functionality to this, it gets a class, and I've styled that class so it appears correctly in the middle. So when we make a bit more progress, we'll start to see this show up on the screen. We're going to be working with a hook called use autocomplete. So we'll come down here and we'll call that function. And this function needs to receive basically a ref to the input field. So it takes in an object and it wants the input field to be an input ref. And we'll just double check that that is there. And if it is, we'll access the current value, which is actually what it wants. It doesn't want the ref itself, but the current property of it. This doesn't exist yet. So if I were to look at the screen, we'd get a big fat error. But what we'll do is we'll come here and we'll set up the input ref to be a use ref hook. And then we can go down, we'll just say initial value of null. We can come and attach the ref here. So we'll say input ref like that. So it's now being shown in the center because it got that class added to it. And I'll show you quickly. I set up, it gets this pack target input class. So I positioned it absolutely to have it show up in the middle with this coloring. It's now available. And what we want to do is keep track of when the user searches something, so like New York, and they click it, I want to access that place and get where it is so that we can reposition the map to that area. So we'll go back to our code. And for that, we can add to the use autocomplete. We can add a onPlaceChanged callback function that receives the place. And then what we can do is we can just double check, hey, if there's no place, early return. Can't do anything with it. If that is there, what I'm going to do is, depending where you clicked, I'm going to take the full formatted address and update the input value so that's what appears in the input. So we'll call set input value. And we'll access the place.formatted address. And if that's not there for whatever reason, we'll access the place's name. So if I were to come back and search for, let's call it Center 100 Center Street, New York. When I click it, it sets the place formatted address in the input. The next thing I want to do is get the position of that place so I can move the map. For that, I need more state. So we'll set up another set of state here. We'll say position and set position, and that's equal to use state like that. And then what we want to do is come here and we'll say set position, and we want to set the latitude. So the way you access the latitude is place.geometry.location, and then lat is a function you have to call. So don't leave off this the parentheses to call the function. And for long, it's the same thing, geometry.location.lng. So when you change the place, it's going to set the position, but we need to detect when that happens so that we can reposition the map accordingly. Because we're working with the map, we actually need to access the map, and we can do that by using another hook provided by the package we're using, Ubi Labs Google Map React hooks, called Use Google Map. So we'll say an object is going to extract the map from Use Google Map. And because we talked about detecting when a value changed, that is the use effect hook. An effect of the position changing is that we want to position the map. So this receives a function, and what are we watching for values to change? Both the position and the map, because maybe when it renders initially, map isn't ready to go yet. So in here, we want to just make sure we're ready to position the map. So when are we ready? Well, if there's no position or there is no map, well, we can't position it if that's the case. But if both of those are true, we can access the map and set the center to the position, and we can reset the zoom level so that it zooms in further to the area that they just searched, and we'll set it to 12. So just to rehash what we did, we attached use autocomplete to this input by setting a ref and passing that to the hook use autocomplete, and we're watching when the place changes so that we can get the place's position and update that in state. And then we can use a use effect hook to watch for when the position changes and then reset the map to that position. So if we come back to our map and we refresh, we come here and we can look up 100 Center Street in New York. Clicking it brings the position, it sets the center of the map to the position. It zooms in a little bit, and then we can click into somewhere in New York and see that New York is growing zone 7A. So then we can go figure out what we can grow in 7A. And that is everything I wanted to cover today. What we did is we set up a bare bones map in React, and then we added data-driven styling to it. We used the different zip codes in the US and we mapped them to growing zones so that we could color the growing zone separately. And then we added an info window by listening to a click on each of those postal code layers. Lastly, we added Google Places autocomplete to the map so that you could search for your area, click it, and it will zoom you in and you can figure out what plants you can grow in your area. Hope you enjoyed this video. Take care. Bye.